Hello friends of Oak Hills, this is Pastor Dale coming to you for your weekly video Touchpoint. Today is May 5th, 2022, Cinco de Mayo, and it's a pleasure to be with you this day. Getting into our points to ponder article, this is part 3 of a deep dive into humility, and this is titled 2 Examples. Last week I proposed this definition of humility, living in light of God's assessment of our nature, position, abilities, and calling. The challenge with defining humility is taking into account the model of Jesus. Many different definitions of humility focus on honesty about our shortcomings and limitations. These definitions cannot apply to Jesus and could lead us away from, not toward, humility. True biblical humility is the posture of living in light of God's assessment of us. How does God view us? How does this impact how we live? 2 biblical examples will be helpful. Let me start by drawing our attention to Jesus again. When Paul puts forward Jesus as an example of humility in Philippians 2, he draws attention to the actions that flow from Jesus' humility, emptying himself and self-sacrifice for others. To understand Jesus' humility, however, we need to look at Jesus' relationship with his Father. Paul says in Philippians 2:6 that Jesus, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. Jesus is willing to submit to his Father's will, which even included Jesus' incarnation and death. The writer of Hebrews explicitly highlights Jesus' submission to the Father's will in chapter 10, verses 5 through 7. He writes, "When Christ came into the world, he said, 'Sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure.' Then I said, 'Behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as it is written of me in the scroll of the book.'" This submission to the Father's will is seen throughout Jesus' ministry. In John 5:19, he says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. Whatever the Father does, that the Son does likewise." In his high priestly prayer in John 17, Jesus says, "I glorified you on earth, having accomplished the work that you gave me to do." And then in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus prays, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." Jesus' example of true humility demonstrates that humility is living in light of God's assessment and will. Jesus followed God's lead every step of his life. Jesus knew his position and calling, the terms of which were established in eternity past in the covenant of redemption between the Father and the Son. Humility does not make one to wallow in self-pity or to lack confidence. True humility does the opposite. Jesus lived each day with his Father's affirmation, strengthening him. "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased," from Matthew 3:17. We see this also in the example of the Apostle Paul. Perhaps we might think Paul is wallowing in self-pity when he writes in 1 Corinthians 15:9, "For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God." He doesn't stop there, however. With one of my favorite adversative conjunctions, Paul puts his humility on display through an exaltation of God's grace. He writes in the next verse, verse 10, "But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me." In verse 9, Paul gives an honest assessment of his sinfulness. In God's assessment, our sin disqualifies and disables us from being productive for the church. But in the assessment of God's grace, we are called and enabled to produce fruit for God's glory. Paul's example shows us that true biblical humility allows our sin to undermine self-reliance and self-confidence, while also drawing strength and confidence from God's grace to be fruitful in the calling he has placed on our lives. There is no self-pity, nor lack of confidence in true humility. Both Jesus and Paul are model examples of humility. Neither were self-directing or self-promoting. They both looked to God for his will and direction. They both drew strength and confidence from God's grace to sustain them. They both were fruitful in their callings to serve the Lord. They both demonstrate that humility is living in light of God's assessment of one's nature, position, abilities, and calling. We'll continue this study next week. Well, various highlights I would like to draw attention to today. First off, we have a new missionary of the month for the month of May. We are highlighting Chris and Mary Granberry. They are the leaders, the director of Sacred Road Ministry that we support in the Pacific Northwest. They have a ministry outreach on the Native American reservations there. They are on the Yakima Reservation in Washington. They've been there some 20 years now, and we've been ministry partners with them for many of those years. Just some details about Chris and Mary today. They are grandparents. Their first grandson was born, Judah, to their oldest daughter, Anne-Marie, in Hawaii. And then their third daughter, Morgan, is getting married here in the month of May. And they have welcomed in their home, just as they were about expecting to be empty nester, they have welcomed a 15-year-old boy and his 11-year-old sister and their 15-year-old cousin into their own home. Chris writes, all three of these kids have been through unimaginable suffering, abuse, rejection, neglect, etc. When they came to us, two of them had been seriously considering suicide. And so they are housing them and caring for them and loving them. And that's one of their prayer requests that we could be praying for these three young people that are living with Chris and Mary. Pray that Chris and Mary would care for them well and have opportunities to share the hope of Christ with them. A couple other highlights to draw attention to and encourage you to be praying for Chris and Mary. They, as the director and leader of Sacred Road Ministry, they have a very full summer up ahead. They have teams that they host in Yakima and at Warm Springs. We were praying for Evan and Holly last month. They will be directing the teams in the Warm Springs. Chris and Mary direct the teams in Yakima. So pray for their leadership and pray for the safety of the teams and the ministry outreach this summer. And then lastly, just pray for the family as they are adjusting to these new experiences, having a grandchild, another daughter getting married. Just pray for their strength and health for their family. I encourage you to check out the print Touchpoint for more details. They share about their springtime and how God was working in their ministry in the month of April. A couple of highlights just to mention in the life of our church. Some big things are happening here. So Sacred Road is the first one. We are sending a team of 8 people to serve on the Warm Springs Reservation, July 2nd through the 9th. And as part of our fundraising effort, we are hosting a pancake breakfast on Saturday, May 21st. If you haven't marked your calendar yet, please do that and plan to join us that Saturday morning at the church for a delicious pancake breakfast from 8 to 11 a.m. We'll be rolling out those pancakes. Joyplosion is coming at the end of this month, May 31st, June 1st, and June 2nd. 3 evenings, 6:30 to 8:30 each evening for kids ages 4 years old up through finishing 5th grade. We'd love for your kids to be registered. Registration is now open on our website, oakhillspca.com. Go there, check it out. Share that with your friends, families, neighbors, coworkers, and encourage them to come out and be a part of it. It's going to be a blast this year. Looking forward to it in just 4 short weeks, hosting Joyplosion. And then we have if you haven't seen it yet, we have a new ministry spotlight video on our YouTube channel featuring Kirby Ingalls and a ministry that he is launching with, Fathers in the Field. I'd love for everybody in our church to watch that. So if you haven't watched that yet, take the time to check that out. And then both our men and women have very special, unique gatherings this month. Next Thursday, May 12th, the men are invited to come on out to Joe Call's home. And it's going to be a delicious night of food, eating together, and fellowship. And as we dig into God's word to sharpen one another. And then the women have a special event in 3 weeks from tonight Topsy Turvy Trivia Night. It's a virtual event that all women are invited to be a part of. Details and contact information in the print version of Touchpoint. And then I want to highlight the youth. Perhaps you're wondering, why is Joyplosion a week earlier than we normally would hold it? It's because the youth have their summer camp the following week in June. So June 6th through the 10th, our youth will be joining up with our sister churches from Presbytery at a camp on Table Rock Lake. It's going to be a wonderful experience for middle school and high school students. Registration is open for that as well. And there, in fact, is a price increase this Sunday, May 8th. So if you're planning to register in the next couple of days for that price discount. And then speaking about Sunday, this is Mother's Day. And as a church, we give thanks for the mothers in our lives, not only our physical earthly mothers, but spiritual mothers, women who have contributed to the faith of the church and supported one another. And we know these holidays like Mother's Day and Father's Day, they're a mixed bag. For some, they're very painful reminders of the loss of a mother or the loss of a child or the inability to conceive, to have children. We don't want to celebrate Mother's Day and be neglectful of those who might be hurting with that, but we do not want to just ignore the blessing that God has given us through mothers. And so I would encourage you to join with us at worship on Sunday, and our focus and our attention is going to be on the goodness of our Savior as we wrap up our sermon series on the Gospel of John. But we also want to just give thanks for the women in our life who have contributed to spiritual motherhood and our growth in the Lord. So thank you for joining me this day for our weekly touch point. I pray that God would bless you, and we look forward to seeing you soon.